In the grand Ravenwood Hall, a lavish dinner hides a deadly secret. When Evelyn Ashford is found stabbed in the library, the charming Miss Jane Marple steps into a web of lies, greed, and betrayal. A shred of blue silk, a cryptic letter, and a ticking clock lead her to unmask a killer among a cast of suspects, each with a motive, each with a secret. Will Miss Marple's sharp wit unravel the truth before another life is lost? Dive into a classic mystery where every clue counts and the final twist will leave you stunned. Chapter 1. The Quiet Charm of Ravenwood Hall. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over Ravenwood Hall, a sprawling Georgian estate nestled in the heart of the Dorset countryside. Its ivy-clad walls and neatly trimmed topiaries exuded an air of timeless elegance, but beneath the polished surface, an undercurrent of unease rippled through its inhabitants. The hall, owned by the wealthy and reclusive Sir Reginald Ashford, was hosting a weekend gathering, a rare event that had drawn a curious assortment of guests to its hallowed grounds. The occasion was ostensibly a celebration of Sir Reginald's 60th birthday, but whispers among the staff hinted at a more pressing motive, a matter of inheritance perhaps, or a long-buried family secret. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window of the drawing room, sipped her tea and observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity. She had not been invited, of course. Such grand affairs were not the domain of an elderly spinster from St. Mary Mead. Yet, her old friend Lady Beatrice Ashford, Sir Reginald's sister-in-law, had insisted she join them. "Jane, dear," Beatrice had written, "your sharp eyes would do us good. There's something amiss here, though I cannot put my finger on it." Miss Marple, never one to refuse a puzzle, had packed her modest suitcase and arrived by the afternoon train. The drawing room was a study in contrasts. Polished mahogany gleamed under the chandelier's light, while the guests' polite smiles barely concealed their private tensions. Sir Reginald, a tall man with a stern jaw and eyes that darted like a hawk's, stood by the fireplace, regaling the group with tales of his travels. His second wife, Evelyn, a strikingly beautiful woman in her late 30s, hovered near him, her laughter a touch too bright. Their daughter, Clara, a pale girl of 19, sat silently, her fingers twisted. Hand trembled as she poured tea. The furtive glance Clara cast toward Captain Ridley, the way Dr. Langston's fingers tightened around his glass when Victor Crane mentioned the Ashford estate. She had seen such gatherings before, in village halls and country houses alike, and she knew that beneath the surface of civility, secrets simmered. "Dinner at 8, my dears," Sir Reginald announced, his voice booming. "We shall have a splendid evening, I trust." Miss Marple smiled politely, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She had no doubt the evening would be eventful, though perhaps not in the way Sir Reginald intended. As the guests dispersed to dress for dinner, Lady Beatrice drew Miss Marple aside. "Jane, I'm so glad you're here," she whispered, her blue eyes clouded with worry. "Reginald has been acting strangely, talk of changing his will, cryptic remarks about betrayal, and Evelyn, she's not herself. I fear something dreadful is brewing." "My dear Beatrice," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but firm, "people are rarely as mysterious as they think. We shall observe, and we shall see." Dinner was a lavish affair, served in the grand dining room under the watchful eyes of ancestral portraits. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, though Miss Marple noted the undercurrents of tension. Victor Crane pressed Sir Reginald about the estate's finances, earning a curt rebuff. Mrs. Crane made a barbed remark about Evelyn's youth, which the latter ignored with practiced grace. Clara, seated beside Captain Ridley, seemed unusually animated, her cheeks flushed as she spoke of her studies in London. Dr. Langston, meanwhile, watched the table with a physician's detached scrutiny, though his eyes lingered on Evelyn a moment too long. At precisely 9:47 p.m., as the dessert plates were cleared, a scream pierced the air. It came from the library, a room adjacent to the dining hall. The guests froze, their faces a tableau of shock and suspicion. Sir Reginald rose, his expression darkening. "Stay here," he ordered, striding toward the door. Miss Marple set her napkin aside, her heart quickening. She had heard such screams before, and they rarely boded well. The library door stood ajar, revealing a chilling scene. Evelyn Ashford lay crumpled on the floor, her silk gown pooling around her like spilled ink.
Langston said.
his voice steady despite the pallor of his face. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly, her mind already at work. "But first, we must ensure nothing is touched. The truth, you see, is often in the details." As the guests retreated to the drawing room, their alibis and motives swirling in her mind, Miss Marple knew this was no ordinary crime. Ravenwood Hall held secrets, and she intended to uncover them, one quiet observation at a time. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Suspicion. The drawing room of Ravenwood Hall was thick with tension, the air heavy with the scent of wax candles and unspoken accusations. The guests sat in uneasy clusters, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight, each casting furtive glances at the others. Evelyn Ashford's death had shattered the veneer of civility, and now the room hummed with the raw edge of fear and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the corner, appeared to be merely an observer, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. Yet her pale blue eyes missed nothing, darting from face to face, cataloguing every nervous gesture and guarded word. Sir Reginald stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of grief and barely contained rage. "This is monstrous," he said, his voice low but resonant. "Evelyn, murdered here in my own home. I want answers." Captain James Ridley, his naval bearing still evident despite the shock, cleared his throat. "Reginald, old chap, we must wait for the police. They'll sort this out." "The police?" Mrs. Dorothy Crane scoffed, her sharp features twisted in disdain. "They'll tramp through here, asking foolish questions and missing the obvious. Someone in this room did it, mark my words." Her husband, Victor Crane, shot her a warning glance. "Dorothy, that's enough. We're all shaken. Let's not jump to conclusions." Miss Marple noted the exchange, her mind turning over the solicitor's measured tone. Victor Crane was a man accustomed to control, yet his wife's outburst had unsettled him. She wondered what else lay beneath his polished exterior. Clara Ashford, pale and trembling, sat on a settee, clutching her handkerchief. "Who would do this to Mother?" she whispered, her voice breaking. She was so kind." Dr. Henry Langston, standing near Clara, placed in St. Mary Mead, I mean. "What do you make of this?" All eyes turned to the elderly spinster, who paused her knitting and offered a small, deprecating smile. "Oh, I'm just an old woman with too much time on her hands," she said lightly. "But I do find that people reveal more than they intend, especially in moments like these. We must simply pay attention." Her words were met with uneasy silence, broken only by the arrival of Inspector Harold Grimes, a stout man with a bristling mustache and a no-nonsense air. He was accompanied by a young constable, who carried a notebook and looked faintly overwhelmed. The inspector surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on Sir Reginald. "Sir Reginald, I presume," Grimes said, his tone clipped. "I'll need a full account of what happened, and no one leaves this house until I say so." "Of course, Inspector," Sir Reginald replied, his voice tight. "Evelyn was found in the library, stabbed with a letter opener. We were all at dinner when it happened." "All of you?" Grimes raised an eyebrow, scanning the group. No one stepped away. A murmur ran through the room. Miss Lydia Wentworth, the distant cousin, spoke up, her voice high and nervous. I did go to the powder room just before the scream, but only for a moment. And I stepped out to fetch my shawl," Lady Beatrice added quickly. "It was chilly in the dining room." Miss Marple noted the alibis, each offered with a touch too much haste. She also observed Captain Ridley's silence. He had not volunteered his whereabouts, though his hands were clasped tightly, betraying his tension. The inspector moved to the library, where Evelyn's body still lay, now covered with a sheet. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her presence unremarkable yet purposeful. The room was as she had seen it: the overturned chair, the open window, the scattered papers. She noted the letter opener, its silver handle gleaming under the lamplight, and the faint smear of blood on the rug. The clock on the mantel still read 9:50 p.m., frozen at the moment of discovery. "Time of death?" Grimes asked Dr. Langston, who had joined them. "Recent," the doctor replied. "No more than an hour ago, I'd say. The wound was precise, straight to the heart." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. A precise wound suggested intent. Crane was speaking in low tones to his wife, who nodded curtly. Clara was weeping softly, comforted by Captain Ridley, whose hand rested lightly on her arm. Miss Wentworth was whispering to Lady Beatrice, her eyes darting towards Sir Reginald, who stood alone, staring into the fire. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with deliberate calm. "People are so very careless," she murmured to herself. "They leave clues in the most unexpected places." As the clock struck 11, the inspector returned, his expression grim. "I'll need statements from everyone," he announced, "and I want to know exactly where each of you was between 9:30 and 9:50 tonight." Miss Marple smiled faintly. The alibis would be telling, but it was the silences, the hesitations, and the glances that would reveal the truth. She had seen it all before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, and she knew that even the cleverest of criminals could not hide from the sharp wit of an old spinster with a knack for noticing. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Clarity. The atmosphere in Ravenwood Hall had grown oppressive, the weight of suspicion settling over the guests like a fog. Inspector Grimes, with his constable scribbling furiously at his side, had set up a makeshift headquarters in the morning room, where he began taking statements. The guests, confined to the drawing room under the watchful eye of a second constable, shifted uneasily, their earlier civility fraying at the edges. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained serene, her knitting needles clicking softly as she sat by the window, her eyes flitting from one guest to another. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, but her mind was a whirl of observation and deduction, piecing together the fragments of the evening's tragedy. Inspector Grimes returned to the drawing room, his moustache twitching with impatience. "Right then," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I've seen the library, and I've spoken to the staff. Now I need your accounts of the evening. Let's start with you, Sir Reginald." Sir Reginald, still standing by the fireplace, straightened his shoulders. His grief was palpable, but there was a steel in his eyes that Miss Marple noted with interest. "I was at the head of the table as always," he said. "We were all at dinner, every one of us, until Shaw," admitting she had passed by the library door but seen nothing amiss. Miss Lydia Wentworth, her voice trembling, insisted she had been in the powder room, though she could not recall the exact time. Dr. Langston claimed to have remained at the table, discussing a medical journal with Victor Crane. The solicitor nodded in confirmation, though his wife Dorothy interjected sharply. "You were awfully quiet, Victor. I thought you'd stepped out for a cigarette." Victor's eyes narrowed. "I was right there, Dorothy. You were too busy gossiping with Miss Wentworth to notice." Miss Marple observed the exchange closely. Dorothy's accusation, delivered with a venomous edge, suggested more than mere irritation. There was a history there, she suspected, one that might bear fruit in her inquiries. Captain Ridley, when questioned, was brief. "I was at dinner next to Clara, didn't leave my seat." His tone was clipped, almost defiant, and Miss Marple noted the way Clara's cheeks flushed at the mention of his name. The girl herself claimed to have been at the table, though she admitted to feeling unwell and distracted, her eyes fixed on her plate. The inspector scribbled notes, his expression unreadable. "And none of you saw Mrs. Ashford leave the dining room?" A chorus of denials followed, though Miss Marple's sharp ears caught a slight hesitation in Clara's response. The girl's hands twisted her handkerchief, and her gaze darted toward the window. Miss Marple followed her line of sight, noting that it led to the garden path visible through the glass, a path that ran alongside the library. As the inspector moved on to question the staff, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need for fresh air. She slipped into the garden, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and made her way to the library's exterior window. The night was cool, the stars sharp against the inky sky. The window, she noted, was slightly ajar, its latch loose. A faint scuff mark marred the sill, as if someone had climbed through, or at least attempted to. She bent closer, her eyes catching a tiny shred of fabric, blue and silken, caught on a splinter. It was too small to be conclusive, but Miss Marple tucked it into her handkerchief, her mind turning over possibilities. Returning to the house, she found Lady Beatrice in the hall, wringing her hands. "Jane, this is dreadful," she whispered. The inspector, though her expression remained placid. "The will, you say?" Beatrice nodded. "Reginald mentioned changing it just last week. He said he wanted to ensure Clara's future, but Evelyn, she had her own ideas. I overheard them arguing about it 2 days ago." Miss Marple filed this away, her thoughts racing. An argument over a will was a classic motive, But it was too early to draw conclusions. She needed more details, more contradictions. As she returned to the drawing room, she overheard Inspector Grimes speaking to Dr. Langston in the corridor. "You're certain the wound was instantaneous?" the inspector asked. "Quite," Langston replied. "The letter opener pierced the heart. She would have died within moments. And the time of death? Between 9:30 and 9:45, I'd estimate. The body was still warm when we found her." Miss Marple's mind seized on the timeline. Dinner had been served at 8, and the scream had come at 9:47. If Evelyn had been killed no later than 9:45, the window of opportunity was narrow. Yet several guests had left the dining room briefly: Lady Beatrice, Miss Wentworth, and possibly others. And then there was the open window, the scuff mark, the shred of fabric. She resumed her seat, her knitting a soothing rhythm against the chaos of the evening. The inspector's questions were thorough, but he was focused on the obvious: alibis, motives, the weapon. Miss Marple, however, knew that the truth often lay in the small things: a glance, a hesitation, a piece of silk caught on a splinter. She would watch, and she would listen, and in time, the puzzle would reveal itself. As the clock chimed midnight, Inspector Grimes announced that the guests were to remain at Ravenwood Hall until further notice. "No one leaves," he said sternly, "and no one touches the library." Miss Marple smiled faintly. The library, she thought, held more than a body. It held the key to Evelyn Ashford's death, and she intended to find it. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Ravenwood Hall, casting long shadows across the drawing room where the guests had reconvened. The air was thick with unease, the previous night's tragedy hanging over them like a storm cloud. Breakfast had been a somber affair. What you knew about Mrs. Ashford's relationships? Any enemies? Any quarrels? A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Sir Reginald, his face drawn and haggard, spoke first. "Evelyn was loved by all who knew her," he said, his voice strained. "She had no enemies. This must be the work of some outsider." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes narrowing slightly. Sir Reginald's assertion was heartfelt, but it rang hollow. No one, she knew, was universally loved, especially not a woman like Evelyn, young, beautiful, and married to a wealthy older man. Mrs. Dorothy Crane, her lips pursed, could not resist a retort. "No enemies, Reginald, really. I seem to recall Evelyn wasn't exactly a saint. She had a way of stirring things up." "Dorothy!" Victor Crane snapped, his tone sharp. "This is hardly the time." "Oh, come now, Victor," Dorothy replied, undeterred. "Everyone knows Evelyn was fond of attention, and not just from her husband." Her eyes flicked toward Dr. Langston, who stiffened visibly. Miss Marple noted the accusation, subtle but deliberate. Dorothy Crane's dislike for Evelyn was no secret, but her insinuation hinted at deeper currents. She glanced at Dr. Langston, whose face had paled, though he quickly recovered, adjusting his spectacles with a practiced calm. "Mrs. Crane," the doctor said evenly, "I assure you my relationship with Mrs. Ashford was purely professional. I was her physician, nothing more." Inspector Grimes scribbled a note, his eyes narrowing. "And you, Miss Ashford?" he asked, turning to Clara. "Did your stepmother have any troubles you knew of?" Clara, her eyes red from crying, shook her head. She was kind to me. We got along well. I don't know why anyone would hurt her." Her voice trembled, and she glanced at Captain Ridley, who offered her a reassuring nod. Miss Marple observed the girl closely. Clara's affection for her stepmother seemed genuine, yet there was a fragility in her demeanor, a hint of something unspoken. The glance toward Captain Ridley was telling, too fleeting to be casual, too intense to be insignificant. Miss Lydia Wentworth, ever eager to contribute, leaned forward. "Well, I did hear Evelyn arguing with someone a few days ago. Constable. But her destination was the hallway beyond. There she paused by a small table where the evening's dinner menu had been left, along with a guest list and seating chart. She studied the chart, noting the positions. Sir Reginald at the head, Evelyn to his right, Clara to his left, followed by Captain Ridley, Dr. Langston, Victor and Dorothy Crane, Miss Wentworth, and Lady Beatrice. The arrangement seemed innocuous, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on the proximity of certain guests and the opportunities it afforded. She then slipped into the garden, retracing her steps to the library window. The scuff mark on the sill was still there, as was the faint trace of lavender she had noticed the previous night. Kneeling carefully, she examined the ground beneath the window. The earth was soft from recent rain, and there, barely visible, was the imprint of a shoe, a small one, perhaps a woman's. She measured it with her handkerchief, estimating its size, and tucked the information away. Returning to the drawing room, she found Inspector Grimes questioning Captain Ridley. "You say you didn't leave the dining room, Captain," the inspector said, his tone skeptical. "Yet the butler mentioned seeing you in the hall just before the scream." Ridley's jaw tightened. "I may have stepped out briefly to check my watch against the hall clock. It's a habit from my Navy days. But I was back at the table when the scream came." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. The hall clock was near the library door, a convenient excuse, but also a risky one. She made a note to check the clock's accuracy later. As the morning wore on, the inspector's questions grew more pointed, but the guests' answers remained vague, their alibis overlapping yet riddled with gaps. Lady Beatrice admitted to passing the library door, but insisted she saw nothing. Victor Crane claimed to have been engrossed in conversation, though Dorothy contradicted him again, saying he'd been distracted. Dr. Langston maintained his professional detachment, but Miss Marple noticed his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. By noon, the inspector announced a break, retreating to the morning room to review his notes. The guests dispersed, some to their rooms, others to the garden, their movements watched closely by the constable. Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, her knitting a steady rhythm as she reflected on the morning's revelations. People are so careless with their work. As she resumed her knitting, a faint smile touched her lips. The inspector was diligent, but he was looking for a villain. Miss Marple was looking for a story, the story of why Evelyn Ashford died, and who among these polished, proper guests had wielded the fatal blade. The red herrings. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Ravenwood Hall, casting intricate patterns on the polished floors. The guests, confined to the estate by Inspector Grimes' orders, moved restlessly about, their nerves frayed by the weight of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner of the drawing room, her knitting needles moving with unhurried precision, her eyes sharp and observant. She had spent the morning listening to the inspector's interrogations, noting the inconsistencies in the guests' stories, but now her attention was drawn to the subtle shifts in their behavior. The truth, she knew, often revealed itself in moments of unguarded distraction. Inspector Grimes had turned his focus to Captain James Ridley, whose naval discipline seemed to falter under scrutiny. The inspector stood before the group, his notebook open, his tone accusatory. "Captain Ridley," he began, "the butler swears he saw you in the hall near the library just before the scream. You claim you were checking the clock, but the hall clock is notoriously slow, 5 minutes behind according to the staff. Care to explain?" Ridley's face reddened, his hands clenching at his sides. "I told you it's a habit. I like to keep precise time. I wasn't in the library, and I certainly didn't see Evelyn." Miss Marple's needles paused. The captain's insistence on his naval habits was plausible, but his defensiveness suggested more than a simple misunderstanding. She glanced at Clara Ashford, who sat nearby, her eyes fixed on Ridley with a mixture of fear and loyalty. The girl's attachment to the captain was evident, and Miss Marple wondered if it might cloud her judgment or conceal a secret. The inspector, sensing a lead, pressed further. "And you, Miss Ashford," he said, turning to Clara. "You were seated next to Captain Ridley at dinner. Did you notice him leave the table?" Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief, her voice barely audible. I don't think so. I was feeling unwell, so I wasn't paying much attention." "Unwell, you say?" Grimes raised an eyebrow. "Convenient, that." "Ignore." As Grimes continued his questions, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the library. The letter opener, the open window, the shred of blue silk. She had revisited the scene in her mind countless times. The letter on the desk, addressed to "My Dearest," was particularly intriguing. It suggested an intimacy, a secret correspondence, but with whom? She resolved to examine it more closely if the opportunity arose. Meanwhile, Mrs. Dorothy Crane seized the moment to deflect suspicion. "If you ask me, Inspector," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you ought to look at Dr. Langston. He was Evelyn's physician after all. Who knows what went on during those private consultations?" Dr. Langston's face darkened, his calm demeanor cracking. "That's slander, Mrs. Crane," he snapped. "My care for Mrs. Ashford was strictly professional. I resent the implication." Dorothy smirked, undeterred. "Oh, come now, Doctor. We all saw how you looked at her. And those late-night visits to the hall, purely medical, were they?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. Dorothy's accusations were malicious, but they were not without purpose. Was she genuinely suspicious of Langston, or was she steering attention away from herself or her husband? Victor Crane, seated beside her, remained silent, his expression unreadable, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders. Inspector Grimes jotted down Dorothy's words, his suspicion now divided between Ridley, Clara, and Langston. "I'll be speaking to you again, Doctor," he said, his tone ominous, "and I'll need a full account of your visits to Mrs. Ashford." As the inspector moved on, Miss Marple slipped quietly from the drawing room, her steps light and purposeful. She made her way to the library, where the constable stood guard. "Oh, my dear boy," she said, her voice frail and disarming. "I seem to have dropped my spectacles in there last night. Might I have a quick look?" The constable, a young man unaccustomed to refusing elderly ladies, hesitated before nodding. "Just a moment, ma'am. Don't touch anything." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied, her smile serene. Inside the library, she moved carefully, her eyes scanning the desk. The letter was still there, its ink dry, its words tantalizingly incomplete. "My dearest," it began, "I can no longer keep silent. Wentworth in navy." None wore blue silk, yet the clue nagged at her. As she left the library, she encountered Lady Beatrice in the hall, her face pale. "Jane, this is unbearable," Beatrice whispered. "The inspector is hounding poor Clara, and now Dr. Langston. I fear he's missing something." "My dear Beatrice," Miss Marple said softly, "he is doing his best, but he is looking for a fox when he should be watching the hens. Tell me, did Evelyn ever mention a letter she was writing? Something personal, perhaps?" Beatrice frowned, thinking. "Not directly, but she did say something odd a few days ago. She said she had to set things right before it was too late. I thought she meant with Reginald, about the will." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The will, the letter, the argument in the garden, each was a piece of the puzzle, but they did not yet fit. She returned to the drawing room, where the inspector was now questioning Miss Wentworth, whose nervous chatter filled the air. "I swear, Inspector, I only went to the powder room," Lydia said, her hands fluttering. "I didn't see Evelyn or anyone else." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts elsewhere. The inspector's focus on Ridley and Clara was understandable, but it was too neat, too convenient. Someone in this house had orchestrated Evelyn's death with precision, and they were relying on these distractions to escape notice. But Miss Marple was not so easily misled. She would watch, and she would wait, for the truth always revealed itself to those who paid attention. Actions, down to the smallest detail. But it was the smallest details, she knew, that often betrayed the guilty. Her attention was drawn to a moment from the previous evening, a fleeting gesture that had nagged at her memory. During dinner, just before the scream, she had noticed Dr. Langston adjust his cufflinks, a nervous habit perhaps, but the movement had been oddly deliberate. She recalled the glint of silver at his wrist, and now, in the morning light, she saw those same cufflinks again, engraved with a small, intricate L. They were distinctive, and she wondered if they might connect to another detail, a detail she had yet to uncover. As the inspector resumed his questions, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need to retrieve her shawl from the morning room. In truth, she wanted to examine the dining room, where the fatal evening had begun. The room was quiet now, the long table cleared of its fine china, but the seating chart remained on a sideboard, a relic of the night's chaos. She studied it again, noting the positions. Sir Reginald at the head, Evelyn to his right, Clara to his left, followed by Captain Ridley, Dr. Langston, Victor and Dorothy Crane, Miss Wentworth, and Lady Beatrice. Her eyes lingered on Dr. Langston's place, near the door to the hall, It would have been easy for him to slip out unnoticed, she thought, especially if the others were distracted by conversation. But what had caught her attention was not his position, but a small detail from the dinner itself. A spilled glass of wine, knocked over by Miss Wentworth as she reached for her napkin. The incident had caused a brief commotion, with the butler rushing to clean it up. Miss Marple recalled the exact time, 9:32 p.m., according to the dining room clock. That moment, she realized, had provided a perfect distraction for anyone wishing to leave the table. She moved to the hall, pausing by the clock Captain Ridley had claimed to check. It was indeed 5 minutes slow, as the staff had noted, reading 12:55 p.m., when her own watch showed 1 p.m. She examined the floor nearby, her eyes catching a faint smudge of dirt near the library door. It was barely noticeable, but it matched the soil she had seen beneath the library window. A clue, perhaps, that someone had moved between the garden and the hall. Returning to the drawing room, timing was accurate. It narrowed the window of the murder even further. She glanced at Dr. Langston, who was listening intently, his fingers once again adjusting his cufflinks. The gesture was subtle, but it struck her as significant, a nervous tic or something more. She approached Lady Beatrice, who was seated near the fire, her face pale. "Beatrice, dear," Miss Marple said softly, "do you recall the wine spill at dinner? It caused quite a stir." Beatrice nodded. "Oh yes, Lydia was so clumsy. The butler was fussing over it for ages. And did you notice anyone leave the table during that moment?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. Beatrice frowned, thinking. I'm not sure. I was helping the butler with the napkins. But I think Dr. Langston stepped out briefly. He said he needed air." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. Dr. Langston's absence, however brief, placed him near the library at a critical moment. But she needed more, a connection, a contradiction, a clue that tied the fragments together. As the inspector continued his interrogations, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the letter in the library. "My dearest," it had begun, with its unfinished plea to set things right. She wondered if Evelyn had been writing to Dr. Langston, whose professional demeanor might conceal a more personal connection. Or perhaps the letter was meant for someone else, Captain Ridley, whose closeness to Clara suggested hidden loyalties, or even Victor Crane, whose financial dealings with Sir Reginald hinted at deeper motives. The inspector's voice broke her reverie. "Dr. Langston," he said, "you claim you were at the table during the wine spill, but Lady Beatrice says you stepped out. Which is it?" Langston's face tightened, his fingers pausing on his cufflinks. "I may have stepped into the hall for a moment," he admitted. "I felt a headache coming on and needed a breath of air." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. The doctor's story was plausible, but it was the third time he had adjusted his cufflinks in her presence. She thought of the silver letter opener, its handle wiped clean, and wondered if those cufflinks might have left a trace, perhaps not a fingerprint, but a scratch, a mark, a detail overlooked by the inspector's men. As the afternoon wore on, the guests grew more fractious, drizzle that mirrored the gloom within. The guests, trapped by Inspector Grimes' orders, had begun to fray at the edges, their polite facades crumbling under the strain of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the drawing room, her knitting a steady counterpoint to the rising tension. Her pale blue eyes, sharp and unyielding, darted from face to face, noting the cracks in the guests' stories as they revealed more than they intended. Inspector Grimes, his patience wearing thin, had gathered the group once more, his notebook filled with contradictory alibis and half-truths. "Someone in this room knows more than they're saying," he declared, his voice sharp. "Mrs. Ashford was murdered between 9:30 and 9:45, and I'm certain the answer lies here, among you." A silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Dorothy Crane, her eyes gleaming with malice, spoke up. "If you want the truth, Inspector, you should ask Victor about his little meetings with Evelyn. They were awfully cozy in the study last week." Victor Crane's face flushed, his composure slipping. "That's nonsense, Dorothy," he snapped. "I met with Evelyn to discuss estate matters, nothing more. You know that." "Do I?" Dorothy retorted, her voice icy. You were always whispering with her, Victor, and don't think I didn't notice those late-night walks in the garden. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on Dorothy's words. The garden, where Miss Wentworth had overheard an argument, where the scuff mark and shred of blue silk had been found. Dorothy's accusation was spiteful, but it hinted at a truth. Victor Crane had a connection to Evelyn that went beyond business. Was it an affair, as Dorothy implied, or something else, financial perhaps, tied to the will Lady Beatrice had mentioned? The inspector turned to Victor, his eyes narrowing. "Is this true, Mr. Crane? Were you meeting Mrs. Ashford in private?" Victor adjusted his tie, his movements deliberate. "As I said, it was business. Sir Reginald asked me to review some documents with Evelyn. The estate's finances are complicated." "Complicated how?" Grimes pressed. Sir Reginald, who had been silent, interjected sharply. "That's enough, Victor. My finances are my own concern. Evelyn had nothing to do with them." Miss Marple, connection, not a professional one. Could it have been meant for Dr. Langston, whose cufflinks had caught her eye, or Captain Ridley, whose closeness to Clara hinted at hidden loyalties? Clara, under the inspector's scrutiny, was trembling. "I told you I was in the cloakroom," she insisted. "I didn't see Evelyn, after dinner." "You called her mother again," Grimes noted, his tone skeptical. "Yet she was your stepmother, and not much older than you. Were you really so fond of her?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "She was kind to me. She understood me, more than father sometimes did." Miss Marple observed the girl closely. Clara's grief seemed genuine, but there was a flicker of guilt in her eyes, a hesitation that suggested she knew more than she was saying. The spinster's thoughts drifted to Captain Ridley, who had been quick to comfort Clara. His alibi, checking the hall clock, was flimsy, and his proximity to the library door at the critical moment made him a suspect. Yet Clara's loyalty to him was evident, and Miss Marple wondered if the girl was protecting him, or herself. As the inspector continued, Miss Marple slipped from the room, her steps soft and purposeful. She made her way to the study, a smaller room adjacent to the library, where Victor had allegedly met with Evelyn. The room was tidy, its desk covered with legal papers and ledgers. She scanned them briefly, noting references to the Ashford estate and a series of transactions dated the previous month. One document, half buried under a ledger, caught her eye. A draft of a codicil to Sir Reginald's will, increasing Clara's inheritance and reducing Evelyn's share. It was unsigned, but the implications were clear. Miss Marple tucked the document back in place, her mind racing. The codicil provided a motive, not just for Victor, who might have resented Evelyn's influence, but for anyone who stood to gain from her death. She thought of Dorothy, whose bitterness toward Evelyn was palpable, and Dr. Langston, whose professional demeanor might conceal a personal stake. Returning to the drawing room, she found the inspector questioning Captain Ridley again. "You were seen in the hall, Captain," Grimes said, "and Miss Ashford's alibi depends on you. If you're lying, it puts you both in a bad light." Ridley's jaw tightened. "I've told you," resumed her knitting, her thoughts weaving through the clues. "People lie to protect themselves," she murmured to herself, "but they also lie to protect others. And in that lies the key." She glanced at Dr. Langston, whose cufflinks glinted as he adjusted them yet again. She thought of the letter opener, wiped clean, and the shred of blue silk, now missing. The truth was close, she felt, hidden in the details of a single careless moment. She would wait, and she would watch, for the lies were beginning to surface, and with them, the killer's identity. The emotional turning point. The rain had settled into a steady patter against the windows of Ravenwood Hall, casting a grey pall over the estate. The guests, confined to the drawing room under Inspector Grimes' watchful eye, were visibly frayed, their nerves worn thin by 2 days of suspicion and scrutiny. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and the weight of Evelyn Ashford's murder pressed heavily on them all. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as ever, noted the subtle shifts in posture and expression, the cracks in the guests' carefully constructed facades. Inspector Grimes, his patience nearing its end, paced before the fireplace. "I've had enough of half-truths," he declared, his voice sharp. "Someone in this room knows what happened to Mrs. Ashford, and I'll have the truth, one way or another." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, silence reigned. Then, unexpectedly, Clara Ashford rose from her seat, her face pale and her hands trembling. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. I saw something that night. I should have said before, but I was afraid." The room turned to her, a collective intake of breath marking the shift in tension. Captain Ridley reached for her arm, his expression alarmed. "Clara, don't," he said softly, but she shook him off, her eyes brimming with tears. "No, James," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I have to tell the truth. I saw Mother, Evelyn, in the hall, just before the scream. She was arguing with someone. I couldn't see who it was, but she sounded desperate. Miss Marple's someone here, and I thought it might make things worse." "Worse for whom?" Grimes pressed, his eyes narrowing. Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering to Ridley again. "I don't know," she said finally. "I didn't see their face, it was too dark." Miss Marple noted the girl's reluctance, the way her words faltered. Clara was protecting someone, she was certain. Perhaps Ridley, whose flimsy alibi about the hall clock had already drawn suspicion. Or was it someone else? Someone whose identity she feared to reveal? The inspector's attention shifted to Ridley. "Captain, you were in the hall at the same time, by your own admission. Did you see Mrs. Ashford arguing with anyone?" Ridley's jaw tightened, his naval composure strained. "I told you I was checking the clock. I didn't see Evelyn or anyone else." Miss Marple's mind turned over the timeline. The wine spill at 9:32, the thud Miss Wentworth had heard around 9:30, Clara's sighting of Evelyn in the hall, and the scream at 9:47. The window of opportunity was narrow, but it was becoming clear that several guests had been near the library at the critical moment. She thought of the shred of blue silk, the scuff mark on the windowsill, and the letter addressed to "My Dearest." Each clue pointed to a carefully orchestrated crime, but Clara's confession had added a new dimension, a personal confrontation, an emotional motive. As the inspector pressed Clara for more details, Miss Marple's gaze fell on Dr. Langston, who sat rigidly, his fingers once again adjusting his silver cufflinks. The gesture, now familiar, struck her as significant. She recalled the letter opener, wiped clean, and wondered if those cufflinks might have left a mark, a scratch perhaps, or a trace of metal. She made a mental note to examine the weapon more closely, if the inspector allowed it. Meanwhile, Mrs. Dorothy Crane, never one to miss an opportunity, spoke up. "Clara's story is all very touching," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. "But it doesn't explain why Evelyn was in the library at all. She wasn't one for books, was she? Perhaps she was meeting someone, a lover maybe." Sir Reginald's face darkened, his voice low and dangerous. "That's enough, Dorothy. I won't have my wife's memory slandered." "Oh, come now, Reginald," Dorothy suggested financial stakes, and Dorothy's bitterness toward Evelyn hinted at personal resentment. As the tension in the room reached a fever pitch, Lady Beatrice approached Miss Marple, her face pale. "Jane, this is tearing us apart," she whispered. "Clara's confession. Do you think she's telling the truth?" "My dear Beatrice," Miss Marple replied softly, "she is telling part of the truth, but not all of it. People often confess to protect someone they care for, or to hide something they fear. We must watch closely now." Beatrice nodded, her eyes clouded with worry. "I heard Evelyn and Reginald arguing again, the night before she died. It was about Clara, something about her future. I didn't catch it all, but Evelyn was insistent, almost pleading." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. The argument, the codicil, Clara's confession, all were threads in the same tapestry. Evelyn had been trying to set things right, as the letter and Beatrice's earlier remarks suggested. But what had she uncovered, and why had it cost her her life? As the inspector announced a break, the guests dispersed, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Miss Marple remained in her seat, her knitting needles moving steadily. Clara's confession had shifted the dynamics of the investigation, exposing new tensions and raising new questions. The truth was closer now, she felt, hidden in the interplay of loyalty and betrayal. She thought of the letter, the cufflinks, the blue silk, and the slow hall clock. Each was a clue, and together they would lead her to the killer. People break when they cannot bear the weight of their secrets, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible. And when they do, the truth comes tumbling out. Chapter 9. The Trap. The rain had ceased, leaving Ravenwood Hall cloaked in a damp stillness that seemed to mirror the uneasy quiet among its guests. The drawing room, now a familiar stage for suspicion and revelation, buzzed with a new energy as the third day of the investigation began. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, sensed a shift in the air, a tipping point where the truth, so carefully concealed, was beginning to strain against the lies. She had watched the guests closely, noting their twisting her handkerchief. Captain Ridley sat rigidly, his naval discipline barely containing his unease. Dr. Langston adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize as a nervous tic, while Victor Crane exchanged a tense glance with his wife Dorothy, whose sharp eyes gleamed with calculation. Miss Wentworth fidgeted, and Lady Beatrice looked to Miss Marple with a silent plea for clarity. Miss Marple, however, had her own plan. She set her knitting aside and rose, her frail appearance belying the sharpness of her mind. "Inspector, if I may," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I believe a simple demonstration might help clarify matters. People, you see, are often betrayed by the smallest details they think no one notices." The room turned to her, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in their eyes. Inspector Grimes, though skeptical, nodded. "Go on, Miss Marple. What do you propose?" "I suggest we return to the library," she said, her tone serene. "There are certain inconsistencies in the scene that might benefit from a closer look. With your permission, of course." Grimes hesitated, then agreed, leading the group to the library, still cordoned off but now a focal point of their collective dread. The constable stepped aside, and the guests filed in, their faces tense. The room was as it had been, the overturned chair, the desk with its scattered papers, the letter addressed to "My Dearest," and the window still ajar. The scent of lavender lingered faintly, a detail Miss Marple noted once more. She moved to the desk, her movements deliberate. "This letter," she said, pointing to the unfinished page, "is most curious. Mrs. Ashford was writing to someone she called My Dearest, yet she never finished it. Why, do you suppose, was she interrupted?" The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but none spoke. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but probing. "And then there is the window. It was open, you see, and there was a scuff mark on the sill, along with a shred of blue silk. One might think someone entered, or left, through it. But the ground outside was soft, and there was only one footprint, a small one, a woman's perhaps." Clara's face paled, and Miss Marple noted the girl's reaction, though she did not press her yet. Instead, she turned to the letter opener, now in the inspector's position. "Langston," she said gently, "you've been most helpful in providing medical insights, but I wonder if you might tell us again where you were at 9:32, when Miss Wentworth spilled her wine. You said you stepped out for air, but the hall clock is slow, and the library door is so very close." Langston's face tightened, his voice steady but strained. "I've told you, Miss Marple, I was in the hall briefly. I didn't enter the library." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course. But you see, the smallest details can betray us. A cufflink, for instance, might catch on a letter opener during a struggle, leaving a mark no one thinks to check." The room went still, all eyes on Langston. He opened his mouth to protest, but Dorothy Crane interrupted, her voice sharp. "This is absurd. You're accusing everyone now, Miss Marple. Why not look at Victor? He was always with Evelyn, scheming about the estate." Victor's eyes flashed with anger. "Dorothy, enough. I had no reason to harm Evelyn. You're making a fool of yourself." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Victor, then back to the group. "Mrs. Crane raises an interesting point," she said. "The estate, the will, the codicil I found in the study, these are all motives. But motives alone do not make a murderer. We need opportunity, and we need intent." She turned to Clara, her voice softening. "Miss Ashford, you saw your stepmother arguing in the hall. You said you were afraid. Was it because you recognized the person she was with, or because you feared what they might do? Clara's eyes filled with tears, her voice a whisper. I don't know. I didn't want to believe it was anyone here. Miss Marple nodded, her trap set. She had planted seeds of doubt, stirred the group's emotions, and now she watched for the telltale signs of guilt. Captain Ridley's hand rested protectively on Clara's arm, but his eyes were wary. Dorothy's accusations were too pointed, Victor's denials too vehement. Langston's cufflinks gleamed, a silent clue to a moment of carelessness. Inspector Grimes, sensing the shift, stepped forward. Miss Marple, if you've got a theory, let's hear it. I'm tired of games. Oh, Inspector, she said, her tone mild. It is no game. It is a puzzle, and the pieces are nearly in place. But we mirror the tangled web of secrets among the guests. The air was charged with anticipation, the weight of Evelyn Ashford's murder pressing heavily on all present. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting set aside for the moment, stood near the fireplace, her frail figure commanding an unexpected authority. The guests, summoned by Inspector Grimes at her request, sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a mix of dread and curiosity. Miss Marple had promised a resolution, and now, with her sharp mind and quiet resolve, she was ready to unveil the truth. Inspector Grimes, his notebook tucked away, nodded to her. Miss Marple, you've hinted at knowing more than you've let on. If you've solved this puzzle, let's hear it. No more delays. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes swept over the group, lingering briefly on each face. Sir Reginald's grief-stricken defiance, Clara's trembling uncertainty, Captain Ridley's rigid composure, Dr. Langston's nervous adjustment of his cufflinks, Victor Crane's guarded expression, Dorothy's sharp gaze, Miss Wentworth's fidgeting, and Lady Beatrice's anxious hope. She smiled faintly, her voice calm but deliberate. "My dear Inspector," she began, "a murder is like a village scandal, full of whispers and half-truths, but the truth always lies in the details. Let us reconstruct the events of that fateful evening, step by step, and see where they lead us." She moved to the center of the room, her presence commanding attention. Evelyn Ashford was murdered in the library between 9:30 and 9:45 p.m., stabbed with a letter opener. The weapon was wiped clean, suggesting premeditation. The window was ajar, with a scuff mark and a shred of blue silk on the sill, hinting at an outside intruder, or a clever ruse. A letter, addressed to "My dearest," lay unfinished on the desk, and a faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. These are our clues, and they tell a story. She turned to the group, her eyes narrowing. Let us begin with the timeline. At 9:32, Miss Wentworth spilled her wine, creating a distraction. Several of you left the dining room briefly, Lady Beatrice to fetch her shawl, Miss Wentworth to the powder room, Dr. Langston for air, and Captain Ridley to check the hall clock, which we know is 5 minutes slow. Clara, an L, and you adjust them when nervous, as you did just now. The letter opener bore a tiny scratch, one that could have been made by a cufflink during a struggle. You were in the hall at 9:32, near the library door. Did you meet Evelyn there? Langston's face paled, his voice rising. This is preposterous. I told you I stepped out for air. I never entered the library. Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone gentle but firm. Patience, Doctor. Let us consider another clue, the shred of blue silk. None of you wore blue silk that night, yet I found it on the windowsill, alongside a single footprint in the soft earth. It was a woman's shoe, size 5. Clara, your shoes are size 5, are they not? Clara gasped, her hands clutching her handkerchief. I didn't go near the window. I was in the cloakroom. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her eyes softening. But you were protecting someone, weren't you? Your loyalty to Captain Ridley is admirable, but it has clouded your judgment. You saw Evelyn in the hall arguing, not with Ridley, but with someone else, someone whose secret she threatened to expose. She turned to Victor Crane, whose face had grown taut. Mr. Crane, you met with Evelyn frequently, discussing the estate. I found a codicil in the study, increasing Clara's inheritance and reducing Evelyn's share. You were pressing Sir Reginald to finalize it, weren't you? But Evelyn opposed it, fearing it would alienate her husband. Did she discover something else? Perhaps your own financial irregularities. Victor's eyes widened, his voice sharp. I had nothing to do with her death. Yes, we discussed the codicil, but that's all. Dorothy Crane laughed bitterly. Oh, Victor, don't pretend you weren't charmed by her. Everyone saw it. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Dorothy. Mrs. Crane, your bitterness toward Evelyn was evident, but it was not jealousy alone, was it? You knew of the codicil, and you feared Evelyn's influence over Sir Reginald. You wore a blue silk scarf last week, did you not? A piece of it caught on the windowsill, perhaps when you staged the scene to suggest an outside intruder. Dorothy's face drained of color. That's absurd. I was at dinner. Were you? Miss Marple asked softly. The wine spill distracted everyone. You could have slipped out. Footprint matches your shoes. And the letter, though unfinished, was meant for Sir Reginald, warning him of your husband's schemes and your own desperation to protect them. Dorothy staggered, her defiance crumbling. I didn't mean to. She was going to ruin us. Victor's investments, the estate, it was all at risk. Inspector Grimes stepped forward, his expression grim. Mrs. Crane, you'll come with me. We'll sort this out at the station. As Dorothy was led away, sobbing, the guests sat in stunned silence. Sir Reginald buried his face in his hands, Clara clung to Ridley, and Langston stared at the floor, his cufflinks still. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting resumed. The truth had been revealed, not through force, but through the quiet observation of a village spinster who saw what others missed. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The drawing room of Ravenwood Hall was hushed, the weight of Dorothy Crane's confession lingering like the fading echo of a storm. The guests sat in stunned silence, their faces etched with a mix of relief and disbelief. The rain had stopped, and a pale sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow over the scene. Inspector Grimes had taken Dorothy away, her sobs fading down the corridor, leaving the others to grapple with the truth. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting once again in her hands, sat quietly in her corner, her pale blue eyes calm but thoughtful. The puzzle was solved, but as always, she took a moment to reflect on the human frailties that had led to such a tragedy. Sir Reginald, his stern demeanor softened by grief, rose from his chair and approached Miss Marple. Miss Marple, he said, his voice heavy, I don't know how you saw what we all missed. I owe you my thanks. But how did you know it was Dorothy? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile gentle but tinged with sadness. My dear Sir Reginald, it is not so much a matter of knowing, but of seeing. In my village of St. Mary Mead, I have observed many people, and they are not so different from those in grand houses like this one. They lie, they hide, they fear, but they always leave traces of their true selves. She paused, her eyes drifting to the group. Clara, still clinging to Captain Ridley's arm, looked fragile but relieved. Dr. Langston, his cufflinks no longer a source of suspicion, sat with a weary guilt by what they say about others. Inspector Grimes, who had returned to the room, nodded grudgingly. You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple. I was ready to arrest Captain Ridley or Miss Ashford, but you saw through the distractions. The silk, the footprint. How did you piece it together? Miss Marple's smile widened slightly. It was the letter, Inspector, that set me on the path. Evelyn was writing to Sir Reginald, her dearest, to warn him of Victor's financial schemes and Dorothy's desperation to protect them. The codicil in the study showed that Evelyn's influence threatened their plans. Dorothy, I suspect, overheard Evelyn's intentions and acted to silence her. The open window and the silk were meant to suggest an outsider, but they were too deliberate, too staged. She turned to Clara, her voice softening. And you, my dear, saw more than you admitted. You protected Captain Ridley because you cared for him, but you also feared what Evelyn's letter might reveal. Your loyalty was admirable, but it nearly led you astray. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know it was Dorothy. I thought it might be father or someone else. I just wanted to protect James. Captain Ridley squeezed her hand, his face softening. You did what you thought was right, Clara. We'll get through this. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the broader picture. Murder, you see, is often a simple thing at its core. Greed, fear, love. These are the motives that drive us. Dorothy feared losing everything, her husband's status, their wealth, their place in society. She acted out of desperation, but she could not hide the small things. The scent of her perfume, the silk from her scarf, the footprint she left in her haste. Lady Beatrice approached, her face pale but resolute. "Jane, you've saved us from a terrible mistake. If the inspector had arrested Clara or James, I can't bear to think of it." "My dear Beatrice," Miss Marple said, "the truth has a way of coming out, if one is patient. I have seen it in my village, time and again. People cannot hide who they are, not forever." As the guests began to disperse, their voices low and subdued, Inspector Grimes approached Miss Marple. "I'll need your statement for the report," he said, his tone gruff but respectful. Her mind already turning to the familiar lanes of her village, where another puzzle, no doubt, awaited her sharp wit and quiet observation. As the car pulled away, she murmured to herself, "People are so very careless with their secrets, and it is in their carelessness that we find them." Chapter 12. The Aftermath. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting Ravenwood Hall in a twilight glow that softened its stern Georgian lines. The guests, no longer confined to the drawing room, moved about the estate with a cautious freedom, their voices subdued as they grappled with the aftermath of Dorothy Crane's confession. The air, though cleared of rain, carried a chill that seemed to echo the lingering unease. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting packed away, stood by the window of the morning room, gazing out at the garden where the fatal events had begun to unravel. Her work was done, but the human cost of the truth weighed heavily on her. Lady Beatrice joined her, her face etched with fatigue but also gratitude. "Jane, I don't know how we'd have managed without you," she said softly. "Dorothy, I never would have suspected her. She was always sharp-tongued, but a murderer. It's unthinkable." Miss Marple turned, her pale blue eyes gentle but perceptive. "My dear Beatrice, it is often the unthinkable that proves true. Mrs. Crane was driven by fear, fear of losing her place, her security, her husband's ambitions. Fear can make monsters of us all if we let it." Beatrice nodded, her eyes distant. "And poor Evelyn, she was trying to do right by Reginald, wasn't she? That letter, it must have been her way of protecting him." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "Evelyn saw the danger in Victor's schemes, and she wished to warn Sir Reginald. But in doing so, she crossed Dorothy, who saw her as a threat to everything she held dear. It is a sad thing, how one person's honesty can provoke another's desperation." The door opened, and Sir Reginald entered, his shoulders stooped, but his expression resolute. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff, "I've been a fool. I trusted Victor, ignored Evelyn's concerns about the estate. If I'd listened to her, perhaps she'd still be here." Miss Marple's smile was kind but firm. "You must not blame yourself, Sir Reginald." Misled the investigation. Miss Marple wondered what future lay ahead for the girl, now that the truth had set her free, but at such a cost. As if summoned by her thoughts, Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady despite her red-rimmed eyes. "I wanted to thank you. I was so afraid. I thought James might be blamed or worse. I didn't know what to do." "You did what you thought was right, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Loyalty is a powerful thing, but it can blind us. You protected Captain Ridley because you care for him, but in the end, the truth was the only way to protect you both." Clara nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. "Father says we'll go to London for a while, to get away from all this. James is coming with us. I hope we can start over." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You are young, Clara, and the young have a way of healing. Trust in that, and in those who care for you." As Clara left, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the garden, where the last light of day illuminated the path near the library window. She thought of the shred of blue silk, the footprint, the lavender scent, all the small details that had led her to Dorothy Crane. They were the threads of a tapestry, woven by human weakness and unraveled by quiet observation. Inspector Grimes entered, his moustache twitching with a mix of respect and bemusement. "Miss Marple, I've just spoken with Mrs. Crane at the station. She's confessed fully, said she acted alone, to protect Victor's dealings. You were right about everything. I don't know how you do it. Miss Marple chuckled softly, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Oh, Inspector, it is simply a matter of paying attention. In my village, I have seen many such dramas. Jealousy, greed, fear. They are the same everywhere, whether in St. Mary Mead or a grand estate like this one." Grimes shook his head, a wry smile breaking through. "Well, I hope St. Mary Mead appreciates you, ma'am. You've saved me from a terrible mistake." As the inspector left to finalize his report, Miss Marple gathered her shawl and prepared to depart. Her train to St. Mary Mead was due that evening, and she looked. Patience cannot uncover them. The car pulled away, and Ravenwood Hall faded into the dusk, its secrets laid bare by the sharp wit of a village spinster.